particular welcome to our lecturer this evening, Professor Athey from Harvard University. Now, regular attendees will know that CReMic instituted these lectures to honour contributions of Sir Richard Stone to the University of Cambridge, not least when he was director of the Department of Applied Economics 45 to 55, which I think a number of people would agree was probably the most productive period of the DAE, Department of Applied Economics, but also to also for his contribution to economics more generally. Now, I think, to my mind at least anyway, a most important aspect of Richard Stone's research in the area of consumer behaviour, which you may know was one of his main areas of interest, was the central role accorded to economic theory in the construction of empirical economic models, and believing this to be necessary to have a theoretical understanding of the decision making by economic agents to inform econometric data analysis, and the Stone theory utility function being a prime example of that concern. And I mention this again today because today's lecturer, I think, is an exemplar of that ideal of a marriage between data and economic theory, using economic theory to frame the types of questions, or give a framework within which the types of questions that we're particularly interested in can be answered. Let me say a few words about Susan Athey. She's Professor of Economics at Harvard University and Chief Economist at Microsoft Corporation. She's widely recognised as a leading international scholar in a number of areas in economics, which include industrial organisation, econometrics, and microeconomic theory. So with that type of interest and background, she's ideally suited for this marriage between data econometrics and economic theory. Her main current research areas cover marketplace design, auction theory, and the statistical analysis of auction data. And particular of her recent work has been theoretical and empirical studies of internet search, online advertising, and news media. Examples again being the talk that she gave to the empirical microeconomics seminar earlier today. Her earlier research included mathematical methods and tools for auctions, industrial organisation, econometric identification, and organisational design. Susan is a recipient of the John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded by the American Economic Association every other year. I think maybe it's every year these days. To that American economist under the age of 40 who is judged to have made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. She's a fellow of the Econometric Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Sciences. She was a Sloan Foundation Research Fellow. She's been a member of the Executive Committee of the American Economic Association and the Council of the Econometric Society. She's presented numerous public lectures, including the 2011 Econometric Society Schultz Lecture, the 2008 Royal Economic Society Frank Hahn Lecture, the 2007 Schultz Lecture at the University of Chicago, and the 2007 Toulouse Lectures in economics. She's filled various editorial roles, including those of co-editor of the American Economic Journal's Microeconomics. She's been a foreign editor of the Review of Economic Studies, an associate editor, I think really, rather than continue the full list, just about basically all the top journals in economics. And of course, concomitant of that, she's published in all of those journals a large number of articles. Let me just say a little bit about the organisation of this evening's lecture. Apart from these introductory remarks, Susan then will present her lecture, which will go on for about 1 hour, 15 minutes or so. And then we'll have a short question and answer session for about 15 minutes. And I've asked Dr. Robert Ritz of the faculty to lead off with a couple of questions to get that Q&A session going. Okay, so Then we'll break for the reception in the adjacent Bateman room, where again you'll be able to engage Susan in further discussion. So without further ado, it gives great pleasure to welcome Susan again here and invite her to give the 2011-12 Sir Richard Stone annual lecture. Thanks very much.
So thanks very much. It is a great honor to be here, and I've had a wonderful day so far here in Cambridge, getting to hear about all the wonderful research that's going on here. Just before I get started, I want to, economists are getting more and more into being careful about disclosure, so I want to mention that the research, some of the research I'm going to present today is using data from Microsoft, and I'm going to be talking about internet search, and so they've funded my research and I've used their data, so anything good I say about Bing or bad I say about Google should be taken with a grain of salt. But of course it's all true. Then without further ado, let me jump in and sort of tell you a little bit about how I want to use the time today. So what I'm going to do is discuss a number of papers that I've written in the area of market design, and particularly the design of auction-based marketplaces. And what I want to do, rather than kind of go into a lot of details on specific papers, although I will go into some detail, I really want to highlight some of the themes that I've developed in my work that kind of cut across papers, and also sort of lay out some things that I see about the future of research, especially using online data, and sort of draw some parallels between sort of old world research and sort of old world problems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on timber auctions, that's kind of old world auction design, and contrast that with designing markets in online marketplaces. So I want to sort of bring in sort of a couple of different kinds of themes, again, sort of economic themes that come up around market design, as well as methodological themes about the methodologies that we've used to design markets. So on the market design side, I want to focus again on designing auction-based marketplaces. So things like eBay, Google and Microsoft search advertising marketplaces would be sort of prime examples of these. And I want to highlight some of the economic themes that have come out of a body of work that I've particularly focused on. And one of those themes is that rather than kind of taking a really narrow view of studying a particular auction in isolation, it can be much more fruitful and important in applied problems to understand how the design of a marketplace affects participation. So for eBay, it matters less how the design of the auction or the level of reserve prices or the way that the auction is structured. It matters less for the revenue in sort of one particular auction, and it matters much more how the market design rules attract buyers and sellers to the platform, and how the market design redistributes rents between buyers and sellers. And in some sense, for the long-term health of eBay, they need to have participants on the platform. And that's the first and most important part of their success. And then sort of the second thing is how they make money on that matchmaking that they're doing. And I'll highlight how those themes have come up in a couple of other policy areas. Then on the methods side, I want to highlight the way, something that I've tried very hard to do in my own research, but also I think is really just coming out naturally in the online world, which is the bringing together of theory, structural models, and experiments. And we've had a lot of controversy and debate in the economics profession over the last 10 or 20 years about which of these methodologies is better. Say in development economics, there's been sort of a huge emphasis on doing field experiments in developing countries, and then some backlash against that. And it's often presented as sort of an either or. You're either doing structural models or you're doing experiments. And what I want to highlight is that in my work, I found them to be very much complements rather than substitutes, and I'll try to show you how that worked for me. But I also want to argue that, in some sense, what I think is, and what you think may be somewhat irrelevant, because it is happening in the world. So Google could not exist without all three of these things: theory, experiments, and structural models. They're integral to the running of any major online business today, and the science of how to combine them is just essential. And so when I can to explain to you exactly why that's true in those contexts, it also can sort of help us feedback to say, well, you know, it's really in some sense not a choice. We're going to be bringing these things together and seeing them together, and so we should be focusing on how we do that best rather than, you know, whether we do. So I'm going to bring this out in the context of case studies from timber and internet search advertising. And these are the two industries I've studied the most. And I kind of like to spend a little time first on the timber to kind of talk about, to show, you know, how we brought all of these things together in a very old world industry. You know, I started studying timber auctions when I was an undergraduate, and all of my friends thought I was very boring, and nobody even thought auctions were interesting, and then sort of eBay came along, and now, you know, everybody has an opinion about auctions, and Google, and it's this huge, you know, the auctions and that Google holds are fueling, you know, the growth of the internet. So this is, you know, a very different era today to think about auctions, and so I want to do some sort of compare and contrast about how the methodologies work in those two areas. So, and in both of these areas, I've done, you know, lots of academic research, but also brought that research into practice, and the policy questions kind of really help guide the research in I think, very interesting ways. So let me start by kind of giving an overview of the theoretical methods, and then I'll go into those in a little more detail. So first of all, when approaching the design of markets, so again, take an example of designing the search advertising auctions that raise all of the money for Google or Bing search auctions, it's extremely important to have a conceptual framework based on the theory literature. And those conceptual frameworks just guide everything about how you would do empirical work. You couldn't even think about doing a sensible experiment in these areas without the theoretical framework that helps guide what you're testing and why. And we've seen in practice, you know, that when you talk to, say, an executive at a top internet firm, you know, you can have a conversation with the president of Microsoft's online services division, who's got thousands of people under him, about, you know, the revenue equivalence theorem and Meyerson's, you know, papers. And so these types of theoretical frameworks are really integral to how the businesses operate, which is really an amazing accomplishment for the theory, to make it all the way into practice in that kind of a deep way. And these papers originally were written, you know, in a very abstract context. Second, I want to talk about the contrast between fixed participation and endogenous participation. So there's a sort of a theoretical literature that grew up, again, Meyerson, Maskin, and Riley, that studied single unit auctions, auctioned for one individual item in isolation, and an analogous literature that grew up in online advertising. And so as we move to the actual market design applications, endogenizing participation is really important. And that's something that I've done from the theoretical side in my work. Now let me talk a little bit about the methods, getting sort of an overview of the themes I'll highlight throughout the talk. Structural models are essential for evaluating market design and algorithms. So again, for the sort of general audience, what is a structural model? A structural model is an economic model where we specify the preferences and the objectives of the participants. And then we use data to help us estimate exactly what the values of those parameters are. So I might estimate what is the value of a bidder in a search advertising auction for clicks. What is the value of a bidder for timber in a particular auction? And the reason that we need these structural models is that we want to consider what would happen if we changed the market design. You know, what would happen if instead of holding a first price sealed bid auction, I held an open ascending auction where people come to a room and place bids on the spot? What would happen if I, you know, raised the reserve prices in a search advertising auction? Okay? And so these structural models are really important for a couple of reasons. First of all, you can explore the space theoretically much better than you can through sort of particular experiments. You can't run enough experiments to sort of explore the space. But secondly, we need to understand and predict what long-run responses will be in markets that might take some time to adjust. So in search advertising, for example, many bidders don't change their bids more than every couple of months. So it can take a long time if you make a change to actually see bidders respond. So even if I did an experiment and I said, I'm going to take, the UK and raise reserve prices there, and I'm going to leave them fixed in France, and I'll let it run for 6 months, it can actually be very, very difficult to learn much from that experiment, because over the 6 months that it takes for things to adjust, 16 other things have happened, the economy has changed, and so on, and so you really can't fully disentangle the long-run response. So the models can really play a key role. The models also help us understand efficiency and revenue trade-offs, and especially if we're interested in participation, we want to make sure that enough advertisers stay on the platform, or that timber firms stay in business, and so on. Small timber firms stay in business. We need to understand what their profits are, because their profits are what's going to motivate them to enter and exit in the long run. So again, those structural models help you do that. And of course, considering market designs that aren't currently in use. But field experiments are also very crucial. And so I'm going to show you some of the work I did in timber, where the Forest Service did field experiments in the 1980s, and I used that data to actually validate the structural models that I built, and to prove that when you estimated in one market design, that you would actually do a good job predicting when the whole game changed. As well, it's going to sort of create variation that's used to identify the models, and allow us to understand the role of new market designs that might require understanding parameters that can only be learned from one market design or another. And I will say that field experiments, again, are just central to the operation of any online business. Amazon.com, eBay, Google, every single time you go to that website, you are in an experiment. All of those websites. You are either in the treatment group or you are in the control group. You are getting a different font, you are getting a different algorithm, you're getting a different ranking, and you are part of the learning process to show what to present the next time. That is just central. Nothing changes. Nothing changes in the Google algorithm and the Bing algorithm without going through an experimentation process. And that is really just a fundamental change in the way that businesses are operated from, 20 years ago. So as you think about training your students and so on, if they're going to go out in the working world, they're going to have to live in a world where sample size and experimental design and critiquing experiments is a central part of operating any business. And so all the new algorithms and so on will go through that process. Okay. So let me then give a little bit of this contrast of how these things are used sort of in the offline world and the online world. So in the offline world, so like in timber, structural models are used in research and very occasionally in policy evaluations for market design. So for example, I helped design the timber auction markets for British Columbia, where timber is one of the main parts of the economy. And I used a structural model to help them figure out what the best reserve price practices would be, and this was very important because it's a key source of revenue for the government. But this was a one-off project that was sort of specially, requested by the government. It's also used in treasury bill auctions, so a number of authors have used structural models to help understand should we use, discriminatory auctions or uniform price auctions in treasury bill. They're used sometimes in antitrust cases and so on. But they're not used sort of on a regular basis by regulators. They're sort of special, expensive, one-off projects. Field experiments are also used occasionally. So like I used the timber field experiment that just some random guy in the Forest Service managed to put together in the 80s, and that was great. They're relatively rare in market design in the offline world, but can be very influential. There was also a field experiment the United States did for the design of their treasury bill auctions in the 90s. But they happen, occasionally, not all the time. So in the online world, things are very different. So one of the first things to emphasize is that the algorithms used to present to you what appears on the screen in Amazon and eBay and Google and so on are structural models. So let me pause and explain what I mean by that. So if you were trying to figure out what should go on a screen, how should I rank the search results, which offer should I put first on Amazon, there are more combinations of things I could show to individuals than I could ever experiment. And so I need a model that can tell me counterfactually what would happen if I re-ranked these results. Okay? So I need to kind of specify that people's demand for clicking on all of this different kind of content is a function of the characteristics of the content and its position on the screen, and that model then can tell me counterfactually, well, what if I re-rank things? And it's going to require some simplifying assumptions, And you better get good causal estimates, because if you don't, you're going to do a bad job ranking your ads. You know, if you just look at the ads that are on the top of the screen, on average, those are different than the ads that are 3 positions down. And so if you don't do a good job estimating the causal impact of switching them, you'll give up a bunch of revenue. Okay? Actually, it turns out this is something economists are better at than a lot of other disciplines, and actually in practice, I think that the algorithms that are used in practice aren't perfect at this, and this is something that is still an area for academic research, to figure out how to design machine learning models that use observational data together with experimentation, that doesn't throw away all the data that's not experimentally generated, but to get more precision, but yet figure out how to use only the causal stuff, sort of like an IV for machine learning. And that's an open area of research that could use some collaboration between econometricians and machine learning people. And actually Cambridge UK is a great place for that. There's great machine learning people here in Cambridge as well. And Microsoft Research has people there that have collaborated with Cambridge to try to improve this, and that's very exciting. The second thing, again, in the online world, we tried to use structural models to predict advertiser behavior. So when you do experiments in online, it's very easy to experiment on users in the short term. I can take 1% of users and give them a different screen. You know, you get one algorithm and you get another algorithm. You get ads with a bright font behind them, and you get ads with a less bright font behind them. And so very quickly, I've got billions of searches coming in a month, so I just need a tiny % of traffic to be able to do a good statistical test that says which font is best. Okay? But that's very short term. If you think about advertisers, it's much harder to experiment on them. They take a long time to even learn what's going on. And of course, all the advertisers interact with one another in a market equilibrium. So just taking 1% of traffic and running an experiment doesn't really get you to learn what the new market equilibrium would be for these advertisers. Of course, the advertisers, this is their business. They're trying to buy clicks on Google to get business, and some of them get most of their business from search. And so if you kind of change the prices, they're going to be very upset. They might exit. They're going to call up your customer service representative. So you can't just sort of experiment on the advertisers in the same way you can experiment on the fonts. So the structural models are really important there. But one of the interesting things that you see, and this is where economics really helps, is that a lot of these firms end up very biased towards the short-term measures and the things that are easy to see in these short-term experiments, and they have a harder time incorporating longer-term factors because they're harder to measure. So just like sort of people have argued about in the development literature that we're doing too many field experiments and it's causing people to stop thinking about the economics, well, if you go to Google, you might complain that we're putting too much attention on the things that we measure in these short-term user experiments, and we're not putting enough attention on longer-term stuff, because that requires structural modeling, and the structural modeling requires assumptions, and maybe we don't believe those assumptions as well, and we can't validate them as well. So let's, here's a very concrete number that I can focus on, and here's a very speculative number that is more difficult. And so you actually see biases emerge in what the firms do as a result of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the different statistical and methodological approaches. In terms of field experiments, again, as I mentioned, they're essential and integral to businesses for a couple of different ways. So if you're trying to train algorithms to figure out what is the right content to put, you have to explore. So your algorithms have to have built-in experimentation, sort of explore, exploit. I'm going to try out this ad in the top position and learn about it so that I can get a good estimate to know how to rank it in the future. As I mentioned, anytime you have a brand new algorithm, it's required to go through an experimentation process before it's released to all of traffic. Experimentation is used to sort of tune algorithms. So you can say, I want to put more or less weight on a certain variable, and I'm going to try out different incarnations of the algorithm. It's the same basic algorithm, but we call it tuning different parameters, and we'll see which one performs the best. And then as well as validating structural models. For example, Ostrovsky and Schwartz did a field experiment at Yahoo where they changed the reserve prices. The structural models predicted what should happen, and they then validated it in a field experiment. But that's much more rare than other things. And finally, Jonathan Levin and Laurent Inev have worked with eBay to exploit the fact that sellers on eBay are doing lots of experiments all the time. So sellers themselves do price experiments, and they identify them and use that variation to learn about price elasticities. Okay. So hopefully that gives you, so these are again sort of themes that I've seen emerge, and it's very interesting to me to step back and think about how these methodological issues play both online and offline, as well as sort of in the academic kind of ivory tower debates, and then seeing some version of those same debates play out in practice, but perhaps with different emphases. Again, nobody would argue that field experiments could be dispensed with in any online firm. I mean, it's just completely clear. The structural models are maybe a little more controversial in some ways, but in other ways, you know, the fact that the click prediction is sort of at the heart of any online website design means that people at some level have to buy into those as well. Okay, so again, now I want to talk a little bit more about the market design insights that have come out of all of this work. So one of the things that's very important when you're trying to design a market, again, like an eBay, is that you have a big trade-off between the size of the pie and the distribution of the rents. So if you're a matchmaker, you know, the size of the pie is like the volume of transactions that are facilitated by your platform. You know, it's the number of advertisers that on a Bing search that are matched with users from Bing that actually make a transaction happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. That's the size of the pie. You have to trade off maximizing the size of the pie and earning a profit for you, as well as distributing the rents among the different players on the platform. I need to give advertisers enough profit to attract them to the system. I need to give sellers on eBay enough profit to attract them to the platform. Just as an eBay example, one of the most important innovations that eBay talks about they've had in the last 6 or 7 years were improvements and changes to their search algorithms. So you type in a query into eBay, and things are going to be ranked according to a search algorithm. If eBay decides to make, say, low-cost shipping or reputation more important for the search algorithms, that changes the equilibrium in the seller market. And they gave an example where they put more emphasis on shipping costs, and a bunch of sellers, you know, dump FedEx and go out and get some low-cost shipping company, which then loses half the packages and makes the consumers unhappy. So it looked great, you know, in the experiment when you held fixed that everybody was using FedEx and UPS, and the users got better deals and they bought more. But then once they highlighted shipping as being really important and the market equilibrium adjusted, then the consumers were worse off. So these are really subtle considerations, and it's one of the reasons all of these firms are extremely hungry for economists to help advise them how to think about it. So one of the themes is that, you know, the indirect channel, the fact that the short-term changes actually affect long-run decisions about entry, exit, and so on often dominates. In internet search advertising, some of the themes that I find are substantial trade-offs between efficiency and short-term revenue. For example, there can be strong trade-offs between efficiency and price discrimination, or efficiency and revenue. There can be incentives to show too many irrelevant ads. In the short run, you get more revenue, but in the long run, consumers stop clicking on ads. Just as another example, suppose that I could figure out the exact right ad for every user. So I knew when you typed in the query shoes, exactly which shoe store I should give you. Well, then in an auction, there's only one bidder in the auction, and so that bidder would be paying the reserve price. It might be very efficient, but it might be bad for revenue unless I get really, really smart at pricing. And of course, that's what economists can help with. But nonetheless, you know, you're not going to be perfect, and you're not really letting the market work in the same way. Okay. And similarly, incorporating long-run bidder and user responses is going to lead to different design choices. Okay. So that's kind of my overview of what I've learned, and now I'm going to go in and sort of show you some of the specific research papers that have delivered those insights. So I'll take a few minutes to talk about my work on timber auctions. This is sort of the old world, and this is based on a QJE paper I have with John Levin and Enrica Serra, and a paper coming out in AEJ Micro with Dominic Coey and Jonathan Levin. So let me talk a little bit about the market design problems we face in timber. So the market design problem, we want to come up with an efficient and revenue-generating market design There's also, and this is the U.S. Forest Service we're looking at, there's an administrative mandate to keep small businesses in business. So there has to be a certain volume of timber that is sold to small businesses. And so we're going to take that policy preference as given for this talk. And then you're going to figure out, well, how do I design this market? First of all, do I want open versus first price sealed bid auctions? Do I want to have, what kind of preference policies do I want? Do I want to hold small business set-asides? Or instead, do I want to hold auctions that are open to everybody, but where I subsidize small bidders? What reserve prices should I set? And actually, what am I selling anyways? If I sell a few big things, that might be very efficient, but I might not get a lot of competition because small bidders can't actually absorb these big tracts. If I sell lots of little things, maybe the market will fragment in some way. So this is kind of, again, the problems are bigger than just the auction, the auction design, auction rules. You actually even thinking about what are you selling. So some of the issues that come up, first of all, there is a few large mills and basically a competitive fringe of small loggers who can enter at low cost. Collusion has been a historical problem in the U.S. Forest Service, and there's been some prosecuted cases. And again, this is a policy mandate to preserve volumes. The broader applications, this is an example of government auctioning natural resources. The similar issues come up in U.S. procurement and like procurement of construction and so on. There's a U.S. goal of 23% of procurement should go to small businesses. And this participant structure of having some big players in sort of a competitive fringe is fairly common, partly because governments use auctions, and auctions make it easy to enter. You don't have to have a relationship. You can just come in and have a competitive bid in the auction, and if you have the most attractive bid, you can win as a new firm, and that kind of that's one of the reasons people use auctions. And collusion is also very common in construction. So this slide is going to summarize about 20 years of research on single unit auctions in one slide. So I'm going to kind of try to highlight some of the themes that have come up from this literature in a very intuitive way, but necessarily high level. So on I've got here some of the different considerations that come up, and then I want to talk about what the theory says if you have exogenous entry and endogenous entry, to sort of highlight some of these differences when we think about market design as affecting participation. And really the gap between the beginnings of this literature was all about this column, and as we get into sort of thinking about designing marketplaces, this column becomes much more important. So first of all, the open ascending auctions versus the first price auctions. So the famous revenue equivalence theorem by Meyerson says that actually the auction format doesn't matter. We should have the same revenue and the same bidder profits no matter how we auction. This is still a stunning result. I get lots of credit every time I explain this to people who don't know it. This is one of these cases where game theory taught us something completely non-obvious but sort of deeply true. Very, very important theorem. But this relies on a bunch of assumptions: independent private values, risk-neutral bidders, symmetric bidders, and competitive behavior. So especially the last two aren't going to hold in the timber auctions, and so we're going to talk about departures from revenue equivalence. And with endogenous entry, since bidder profits are the same, entry also is the same. And so, in fact, the revenue equivalence also holds. So then you bring in asymmetric bidders, and you introduce an efficiency versus revenue trade-off. And in an open ascending auction, people keep bidding until the price reaches their value. And so you always get an efficient allocation. But that's not the revenue maximizing outcome. In a first price sealed bid auction, you get something that's more close to the optimal auction. In an optimal auction with asymmetric bidders, you want to bias in favor of the weak bidders. You want to make the weak bidder be a stronger competitor for a strong bidder, where weak is someone who on average has low values, and a strong bidder is someone who on average has high values. If you think about it, if you have an open auction with a strong bidder and a weak bidder, probably the auction ends very quickly at a very low price. But in a first price sealed bid auction, the strong bidder is worried about that small chance that the weak bidder is going to have a high value and bid high, and so they bid more aggressively to avoid giving up their profits. As a result, you get inefficient allocation because the weak bidder knows they're probably going to lose, and so they bid very close to their value, and the strong bidder is trying to bid a big profit margin. So the first price auction is inefficient but raises more revenue. As a result of that, the first price auction is much more attractive to weak bidders. That's going to actually reinforce the revenue advantage of a first price auction, because what it means is that if you hold a first price auction, this competitive fringe of small bidders is going to realize they have some chance of winning, so they'll enter the auction, and that additional entry in turn makes people bid more aggressively and gets higher revenue. Okay, then collusion. So ascending auctions are vulnerable to collusion. If Oliver and I agree that we're not going to bid against each other in an open auction, we can walk into a room and watch each other bidding. And if we say we're not going to bid above 10, and Oliver bids 11, well, I can bid 12, and so Oliver hasn't gained a thing from his deviation. Okay? But in a first price sealed bid auction, where we write down secret bids and mail them in, he can cheat on me, and I won't find out until he's won the auction. In terms of preferences, so it turns out that, of course, if you have exogenous entry and you take away some competitors, the only thing that can happen is revenue can go down. So set-asides are just bad. So you can, an economist would say this is a terrible government program to have these set-asides. Instead, you should have subsidies which can mimic an optimal auction and make weak bidders stronger competitors to strong bidders. So with endogenous entry, the story gets a little more complicated. If I tell all the small bidders that the big bidders won't be there, well, more small bidders show up. And in fact, what we find in the data is that, and it's theoretically possible and empirically true, that you can get almost no revenue cost from a set-aside because of the entry effect. Okay, and this is also something that you think about, that firms like eBay and Microsoft and Google think about, is that if you can do something that's advantageous to small bidders, and the extra competition that they create can more than compensate for the inefficiency that you create. But subsidies are also a possibility, and in fact, they can always dominate a set-aside. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about how we evaluated market design in the timber context. And so the context we have is that we had field experiments as well as settings with selection on observables. Let me focus on the field experiments. So when we do the field experiments, we had a randomized design where the open ascending versus first price sealed bid was randomized by region in Idaho and Montana. For set-asides, we had cases where basically it was on observables, so large-scale sales were excluded from being set-asides. And then there was a deterministic policy that determined small sales, whether they would be set-asides or open to all bidders. So we have this variation in the data. And this is a really unique opportunity. It's very rare to see sort of two different games being played by the same set of participants. Okay? And so this is something that, even though in some sense timber is a little bit boring, why did I keep working on timber? Well, this is just a really unique opportunity methodologically, because if I have two different games, I can estimate a model on one game and see how it fits on another game. And that's a really tough test for a structural model. The model is going to say, how would people behave if I give them a completely different game? I'm going to estimate their preferences, but the game they're playing doesn't look like the game that was in my data that I used to estimate. And so the model really has to be smart to do a good job. So just as a little bit of an overview of some of the reduced form results, we find treatment effects of the auction method. We find these are just the estimates of the treatment effects and their standard errors. And up here we've got different outcomes. So we find that having a first price sealed bid auction gets more small bidder entry, loggers, and the loggers win more often, and there's a 10% revenue effect. So this is nice, but without a structural model, it's a little bit hard to know whether these numbers are consistent with each other. So is it the case that this 10% revenue number that first price sealed bid auctions make more is actually internally consistent with the level of entry that's brought in? And it's going to turn out the answer is somewhat no. And the structural model will help us disentangle that. When we look at set-asides, we see that when you have set-asides, you get a lot more entrants showing up, just as I mentioned, predicted by theory, and very little revenue cost. Okay? So we can get that just by evaluating a field experiment. Okay, but now I'm going to show you some of the things we can do when we add a structural model on top of that field experiment. Oops, sorry. Forgot I highlighted things. Okay. So the methodological steps, which, again, it's not that this is rocket science to figure out to do, it's just that very rarely people have done it, because very rarely people have had the opportunity to do it. But I would say that, for those of you going out and designing new field experiments and, coming up with new settings, this is really something to look for. This is powerful. I'm sure it's part of the reason I get these papers published so well. Not that people cared so much about timber, but the methodological aspects of it are really nice and really interesting and can help you generalize to behavior of firms in more general settings. So, methodological steps. So, we're going to take identification and estimation with one market design or behavioral assumption, predict out of sample to alternative designs, and do validation and model selection. So I talked already about validation. By model selection, I'm going to compare the predictions from alternative models to actual outcomes. So I'm going to say which model fits better, collusion or competition. And then once I'm happy with step 3, everybody believes my counterfactual analysis and I can go to town. Okay. All right, so let me talk a little bit about how the structural models are set up. So the primitives of the model, the things I'm estimating, in an exogenous entry model would be the value distributions for the bidders, how much do they value timber on average, as well as a distribution of unobserved heterogeneity. When I bring in endogenous entry, I also have to estimate entry costs. So what I'm going to want to do then, once I have all these things, if I know entry costs and values, I can predict everything about who enters and what they do once they enter in alternative designs. Behavioral assumptions compare Nash equilibrium to collusion. And with an endogenous entry, I can think about entry of this competitive fringe with a zero profit condition. Okay, so let me move on and talk about what I do now. So what I do is in each of these 2 papers, I'm going to estimate my primitives using first price sealed bid auctions where I assume competitive behavior and models with unrestricted participation, so not set-aside auctions. If I have that, I can get the value distributions for both large and small bidders and the entry costs. Okay, so that's the whole primitive of the model. And now, once I have that, I'm going to predict out of sample, say, to ascending auctions, what are the bids, what are the profits? Once I know the profits, I can predict entry. And I can test the model. I can compare actual entry to predicted entry. And I can do model selection. I can say which model fits the data better in terms of competition versus collusion. For set-asides, I can predict out of sample the bids and the entry, and I can test the model by comparing my actual entry and revenue to the predictions. Okay. So here's just some of the data that we see for the set-aside auctions. So up here, I've got on the left side, I've got outcomes that I would measure. Up here, I've got actual outcomes. These are the predicted outcomes of my model. And then this column is the validation. So I compare the actual outcomes to what I predicted. And so you want these numbers to be close to 1 to have a good fit. Obviously, I put they're close to 1. That's why I'm touting them. If they weren't, would have gone back to the drawing board. And I have 2 panels. These are tracks that were sold by unrestricted sale and tracks that were sold by set-aside. So first of all, when I do my in-sample validation, I do a good job fitting the data, even though I have some functional form assumptions along the way. Now, what's interesting is to look at the out-of-sample validation. So what I want to do is compare what does my model, which was estimated on unrestricted sales, what does it predict should happen in set-aside sales? And so one of the things I really want to focus on is that our model predicts very different levels of entry for small bidders for unrestricted sales and set-asides. In the actual unrestricted sales, there's only 2.71 small bidders. And in the actual unrestricted, there's 4.5. So that is a very big behavioral change. And so what I've done is estimating using sales that only got 2.7 small bidders. I'm going to predict how many bidders should show up if I change the game. And voila, I predict 4.71, not perfect, okay, but, it's a big leap to go from 2.7 to 4.7, and that's why I say that my model did a reasonably good job, and I hit the prices really closely. Okay. Then when I do model validation and selection for the open versus ascending auctions, I have a similar type of thing, and so what I want to do here is do model selection. So I've got I want to predict, again, I estimate using first price sales, and I want to predict what happens if I have an open ascending auction, and I have two behavioral assumptions, competition and collusion, okay? And so what I want to do is see which one fits better. Well, first of all, I show that I fit the entry very well in the ascending sales. So estimating from first price sales, I say how many small bidders come to the ascending sales. Again, it's lower, so fewer are coming to ascending than first price, and I hit that pretty well. Then I compare whether the prices predicted by competition or the prices predicted by collusion are a better fit. So competition is a bit closer, but you can actually reject that it's exactly that, and actually collusion in about 25% of the auctions is most consistent with the data. Okay. So, all right, so let me move on from offline to online. But in some sense, these are some of the, some of the methodological things that I've tried to do in the online. Oh, that I try to do in the offline world. And then interestingly, when you move to the online world, and especially when you try to convince people to listen to you as an economist in practice, these things of validating the model are really important. If I'm out there telling Bing how to organize their auctions, they've got a bunch of engineers and computer scientists. They don't care that I'm a famous economist, and they don't care that all economists assume profit maximization. They want to see if the model works. So validation, like I just showed you, is a really important thing. And so then you have to create the experiments that allow you to validate. Okay. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about internet search advertising. So here's an example of a search screen. This is one on Bing. Up here I've got ads, and over here I've got ads. Oops. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. So these are the ads. So this is an example of an auction-based platform like eBay and so on. And again, one of the key insights is going to be how important participation is. So auction-based platforms are like other two-sided markets, except for there's an auction at the center. So a two-sided market is something like credit cards, or where you're bringing together, say, merchants and credit card holders. There you're charging fees. In an auction-based platform, you commit to using an auction for allocation. So like on Craigslist, matching just happens by people finding ads and emailing. On eBay, matching happens by having an auction and finding the highest value guy. And on online advertising, the first spot is determined by having an auction for that spot. So in a paper with Glenn Ellison, we develop a model that incorporates the welfare of all the different participants and can really help move away from just looking at one auction to looking at the market. So one of the features that we introduce into our theoretical model of search advertising is the fact that the extent to which consumers pay attention to ads and click on them is endogenous. Okay? So if every time you click on an ad, it takes you to a link farm or some spammy page, then you're going to stop clicking on ads. If you search for tennis shoes and you click on the ad and it takes you to dress shoes, well, you're going to start thinking that these ads actually aren't very good. Okay? And you might click on them less. So one of the things that we endogenize is how the auction is going to do in selecting the best ads, and how things like, say, reserve price are going to affect the quality of the ads, which in turn causes consumers to click more. Another aspect that I endogenize in an extension that didn't make it into the published version is the opportunity cost of ad space. So when you put up ads, there's going to be less, the algorithmic results are going to be pushed further down the page. So, here are these ads, they're taking up space. If these ads aren't very good, then the user isn't going to have a good user experience, and they're not going to come back and do more searches on Bing. So, on the one hand, you get revenue from these ads, but on the other hand, if they're not good, they're going to hurt the user experience. And so you want to think about the participation of those guys. Similarly, you're going to have to think about the profits of the advertisers if you want to have them around to bid in the auction. So, I've got this little picture here that kind of helps conceptualize the way a platform operator might think about setting reserve prices in the environment of search advertising. So on the x-axis is the reserve price, and on the y-axis are dollar profits. And so the model is going to have predictions for how the reserve prices affect the different constituents. So the users have an interior optimum reserve price. If you set the reserve price too high, you're going to price off the page ads that actually might be the best result for the user. Especially on commercial queries, an ad can actually be better than the algorithmic result. The advertiser is going to have a landing page that's specific to the query. The advertiser that bids the highest in the auction, and this is part of the model, is the one who's most likely to make a sale to the user. And that information the advertiser has, the algorithms don't have. And so you can get better ad results than algo results when you allow the advertisers to bid and reflect their value for the space. So the users like an interior optimum. The advertisers generally don't like reserve prices, although actually even a little bit of reserve price can be good for advertisers because it gets rid of the worst ads and makes the users click more on the ads that are left. The search engine is in conflict with the advertisers because the reserve prices are a transfer between the advertisers and the search engine. Okay? So overall, a platform is going to think about, okay, this is my short-term revenue optimal point. But maybe if I'm competing, if it's not just, say, a Google monopoly search engine, but there's a competitor search engine like Bing, which in Europe it's a real question for you of whether you're going to have competition in search, you might make different choices about the reserve prices. So if you have competition, you might push towards the user side and raise reserve prices to have fewer ads on the page. On the other hand, if you're worried about attracting advertisers, you might lower reserve prices to make the advertiser happy. And actually, overall, you can be stuck between a rock and a hard place sometimes because you have to figure out which constituency is most sensitive and most important to you and how you set your policies. Okay? So kind of an overall theme is that there can be a trade-off between efficiency and revenue, and a platform designer has to really have a good understanding and a model of all of the constituents in order to do the design. So if you think about, how do you actually design these markets, you're going to have measures for the welfare of all of the constituents, and anytime you change an algorithm or make a policy change, you're going to kind of make a plot like this and think about how they affect everybody, all the constituents. Okay, let's see. Let me actually skip on to to my next slide. So one of the things now I want to talk about is to give you sort of a little bit of institutional information about how the field experiments and the structural models and everything all fit together in practice. And then I'll come back and talk about how I use a structural model and as well as field experiments to evaluate the effects of one of these different algorithms. Okay? So we can think about the algorithm for click prediction. That's a structural model that predicts clicks for alternative rankings of content. That structural model is going to be used, again, to tell me counterfactually what would happen if I re-ranked the ads. And just as a bit of institutional detail for those of you who know maybe a little bit about search advertising is sold per click, but of course what you're selling is a spot on the screen. So advertisers pay per click. Of course, the search engine cares a lot about how many clicks you're going to get because their revenue is number of clicks times price per click. As a result, the click prediction algorithm is like the central algorithm that determines revenue and stuff in the platform, because you basically, for every advertiser, I have to have an estimate of how many clicks they're going to get to even evaluate how much they're actually bidding. So if, you could have somebody who's bidding $10 a click bidding against somebody who's bidding $1 a click, but if the guy who's bidding $1 a click gets a lot more clicks, that's the ad you want to pick. So the accuracy of this algorithm is really important. So how do you actually develop these algorithms and evaluate them? Well, first of all, you're going to have an online experimental platform, and they do what you call A/B testing. So there's algorithm A versus algorithm B, and they're going to run on traffic. So you're going to have a control group and a treatment group, and you're going to make sure that those are similar. And then you're going to run those algorithms and have them sort of run a horse race. And for each of the algorithms, you're going to be measuring the kinds of metrics I just talked about so that you can trade off their effect on advertisers and users and revenue. Within those algorithms, there often is exploration built in. As I said, you've got the algorithm itself has to be able to learn to be able to figure out if a new advertisement comes on the screen or an advertisement that's usually in the bottom position, it doesn't get a lot of clicks, so I might not even know how good it is. So it needs to do experimentation within the algorithm. Okay, so then ads are shown to users by both algorithms. At that point, those algorithms are actually going to produce scores and actually show stuff to the users, different things from the different algorithms, then the users are going to click on things. Now you've got data. Okay? So that data is going to feed back into, say, a database of metrics that say how many clicks did each of these ads get when they were in each of these different positions with these different kinds of users and different times of day. So you're going to have a huge database of data, which in real time gets fed back into the algorithm. Okay, so you're in real time, the algorithm is getting sort of new input data. So the algorithm itself, the estimation of the parameters of the model is sort of fixed for a period of time, or the number of variables that are in the model are fixed. But all along the way, you're generating new data, and so the x variables that go into the betas are kind of fixed to a certain extent, but the x's are going to be changing all the time so that you get new rankings coming on. Okay. So I run those algorithms against each other, and I look at the metrics, and I might say, okay, this algorithm is better than that algorithm, and so now I'm going to, think about rolling out this algorithm to the market as a whole. Okay? So that's all great if it's something that's sort of user-facing, but actually the accuracy and the way the click prediction model works is also going to affect advertisers. And as I mentioned, most of the experiments are run on users, so you randomize users, but it might be 1% of users getting algorithm B. The advertisers don't even know they're in an experiment. They just had a little noise in their experience, but the advertisers have no idea the experiment even happened. So the advertiser might, this is, say, the control algorithm, the one that's being used for most of the system. The advertiser will get their clicks and pay their prices based on the quality scores. But if I make a change to the algorithm as a whole, then they're going to get different metrics. Then the advertisers will update their bids. And that's going to change the database of advertiser bids that also goes into the auction. Okay? So when I evaluate one of these things, I would just use the data I read from what they call the scorecard to select among algorithm A and B from the user perspective. But to predict advertiser welfare and advertiser behavior, I might need a structural model. And then in the long run, if I roll out algorithm A, they're actually going to notice it and make a change. Okay? So this is sort of, this is a very complicated system, and it really requires a lot of science to even understand, how to evaluate it and how to make it work. I mean, the algorithm itself has a team, and it requires years of R&D to make the algorithms, and then it requires sort of economic science, in a sense, to understand what the algorithms did and what their implications are. Okay, and so this kind of this institutional detail, what I want you to take away from it is just how intertwined the models are and the experiments, and they just live together really closely in a lot of ways. The algorithm itself is a structural model on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's still this healthy tension that we feel as academics about this is like the sort of short-term development field experiment that just tries two things and you get the user metrics, and this is sort of the structural model that the I/O people build. And those people are kind of fighting with each other about which numbers you should listen to and what's the best thing for the long term of the platform. And those debates very much mimic the academic debates that we have. Okay. Oops. All right. So again, just sort of the methodology for evaluating the design change. We're going to, so a specific example that I can talk through is, how do I think about evaluating a new click prediction algorithm? So one of the things that I need is this structural model of user choice among ads, and we need to use user-level experiments to identify and estimate the causal effect of re-ranking ads. So there's an experiment and experimentally generated data used to just estimate the click prediction algorithm. Then once I have that, I can predict the short-term counterfactual impacts on clicks from changing and ranking a new algorithm. Then I can use a structural model to predict the advertisers. And so I have a paper that's hopefully getting close to publication after a couple of years with Denis Nekopolov that actually is a structural model for evaluating advertiser behavior and predicting it. And this model has been adopted and used by Microsoft to help them evaluate changes. Although, again, in terms of what gets paid attention to, the structural models get less attention than the more definitive experimental results. And then you can validate it after a new algorithm is adopted. And so Michael Ostrovsky and Michael Schwartz validated a similar model to mine in a large-scale field experiment at Yahoo. So just let's see. Let me give a little bit of an idea about one of the kind of methodological challenges that comes out in just even doing the click prediction algorithm. And I talked a little bit to Oliver about this earlier today. It's not so much actually that this particular application is so compelling, but I've selected it because I want to actually suggest to people just a little tidbit of what some of the intellectual possibilities are for research between machine learning and econometrics. So when we're trying to understand a click prediction model, I've got all of these different ads and all of these different queries. I might see 50 million different unique user queries in a month. So I've got a lot of things that I'm seeing only once or twice that are very rare. And so it's really, even though you can experiment and explore, you can never come close to understanding all of the combinations of the hundreds of millions of ads and millions of queries. So we need this structural model. And the way that these models work in practice, as I kind of said before, is that as the models are operating, they're generating data which is getting fed back in. So one of the scientific challenges for statistics and machine learning is to figure out how to make use of the observational data that we see and not just the experimental data that comes from exploration. So I can tell as a search engine where I experimented and explored with new ads, but that's not enough data. I really want to use all the data from all the users and all of the ads that they saw. To estimate my very, very rich model. Hal Varian once said he was running the world's largest logit model, and it's really true. So if I want to do that, it's sort of like you have kind of an IV-ish problem, an interventional variables type problem, where you have all this observational data, and some of the variation in where the ads were put, even when you didn't have an explicit experiment, was actually random. But some of it isn't random. And so how do you make your algorithm learn from just the exogenous variation, like we do in IV, kind of at large scale? And that's sort of an unsolved problem. The machine learning people generally don't even really think about it this way. I've tried to pose the problem to them, but so I just say that this is an example that I've observed where bringing disciplines together, say econometrics and machine learning, could lead to interesting research breakthroughs, and also actually, if you solve this problem, you could probably, Google's making $30 billion a year. If you increase revenue by 5%, it's non-trivial commercial innovation as well. Okay. So I just do in this little example here, I show the contrast of actually just literally using an IV approach versus using observational data for clicks. The fact that more clickable ads are in high positions and the ad ranking responds to individual users means that there's an endogeneity problem. The ads in the high positions tend to get clicked more. And so what I did here is I used a whole bunch of historical experimental data from Microsoft, but it was more data than just in the exploration flights. And I said, basically, I'm going to use the fact that you were in an experiment and a little bit about the experiment as instrumental variables in estimating a click prediction model. And that's not exactly what they do in practice, but it's more to kind of highlight, what is the potential of doing it this way. So like here's an iPhone query and the query for Viagra. These are sort of queries that you need to have queries that get a lot of searches on the same term to do this in a really clean way. So I can see what are the estimated impacts of position if I just use OLS versus if I use instrumental variables using past experiments that were conducted for other purposes to generate more data, but use IV to make sure that I use that data to get really good causal estimates. And so the IV estimates show a smaller position impact than OLS, which is basically saying that I'm sort of attributing too much. I've got bad ads in the bottom position, so my OLS estimates make me think that if I took the thing in the top position and put it in the bottom position, it would lose all its clicks. But in fact, if I took the thing from the top position and moved it to the bottom, it wouldn't lose nearly as many of its clicks, because part of the reason the things in the low position are getting not a lot of clicks is because they're bad. Okay, so this is very intuitive. This isn't rocket science, but this is more intended, again, to be motivation of the kinds of problems that you face and how, kind of using experimental data, even if it wasn't generated as an experiment, is something that's very natural to an economist. It's very natural to me to use those as instrumental variables. Machine learning people have no idea what I'm talking about. This is not a way that you normally think about the data. They either want to use sort of the clean experimental data and say that's the only data I can use, or they just want to use all the data and say, well, those endogeneity problems probably aren't that big to start with. And this is saying, well, actually endogeneity problems are really big, and so if you're just using all the data, you're screwing up. But, actually using experimental data in IV can get you some reasonably precise effects. Okay. So now let me go to the, let's see, how much to have an hour and 15, right? So I've got a few more minutes. So let me then go to another sort of richer economic application. And so to do this, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about the search advertising auctions. So I saved the stuff with the math and the notation till the end. So those of you who want to sleep for the next 15 minutes can, but I promise I'll try to explain it if you decide to stay awake. So I want to tell you about the exact auctions that are used for search advertising. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the theory and then the structural model that I use and some of the counterfactuals. So first of all, part of the reason it's actually hard to do presentations in this thing is that the auction that's actually used in practice is complicated to explain. So Google and Bing use, and this isn't even exactly what they do use, but they started out using a click-weighted generalized second price auction. It's a mouthful just to say what the heck they're doing. So this is what they're doing. So let me tell you about the different components. First of all, click-weighted. Well, they sell clicks. So if you bid per click. Okay? So when this market first started, they sold boxes for ad space, just like today, advertising on, say, the BBC homepage is a little box and you pay to be in that box. That was the way this market started. It didn't work very well. Selling impressions in different positions can lead to thin markets. If you think about it, the search screen might have 8 different boxes, and so it would be very easy for the advertisers just to sort of divide up the market. I bid for one box, you bid for the other box, and we don't compete against each other. So a term that was, I think, very nicely coined by Paul Milgram and talked about in a paper by Levin and Milgram is conflation. So one market design trick, when you have lots of heterogeneous things, like 8 spots on a page, and maybe lots of different queries on top of that, is that you take heterogeneous things and make them homogeneous. So what is the difference between being the top position and the side position? The main difference is you get less clicks in the side. But sort of, not quite, but sort of, a click is a click. Once somebody actually clicks on your ad, the profit from them is pretty similar. So instead of selling 8 different spots on the screen, I'm just going to sell clicks. I'm going to hold an auction for clicks. And that makes a thick market where everybody has to compete against each other for clicks. Okay? And so then I'm going to basically think about putting them in different positions, and the advertisers understand that if they bid higher, they're going to be in a higher position and they're going to get more clicks. Now that's the click-weighted part, so I'm going to use scores that estimate how clickable the ads are. So how clickability is a term coined by the people at Yahoo, and clickability is an estimate of the counterfactual click-through rate an ad would get if it were shown in the top position. That is the output of the click prediction model. It is the clickability score. I want to be able to compare ads that actually were shown in different positions on equal footing. So the one in the third position, I kind of understand that it didn't get a lot of clicks because it was in the third position, so I can give it a higher clickability score than you would otherwise expect given the number of clicks it got. The guy in the first position automatically gets a lot of clicks, so he has to get more actual clicks to get the same clickability score. This is the quality score, or the clickability score. So then I hold a generalized second price auction. Why is that? Well, these things used to be sold by first price auction, and it went very badly. Kind of like gas stations across the street from each other, cycling. So I could bid a little bit more than you and pay my bid and be in the top position, and then you could jump over me and get to the top position, and I could jump over you and get a lot more clicks on top position, and then at some point you realize you're paying so much you'd rather pay a whole $1 less per click and get less clicks. So there was a lot of cycling. So one of the Google's first 20 employees went out and read up a little bit and didn't quite understand the Vickrey auction, but had this sort of intuition that, gee, a second price auction might be more stable than a pay your bid auction, because your price doesn't actually depend on the amount that you bid unless it causes you to change positions. Turns out the generalized second price auction isn't quite a Vickrey auction. Life would be more convenient if it was, but it's not. And it does give incentives for bid shading, but it does also have the stability properties that the Google engineer anticipated. So how does the second price auction, the generalized second price auction work? You pay the minimum you need to maintain your position. So I can just walk through an example here. Here are 3 per click bids. Then I figure out their S's are their clickability scores. And if I multiply your clickability score times your bid, that's how much revenue I think I would earn if I put you in the first position. So I'm going to rank the ads by the total revenue that I think they would create if they were in the first position. Now, this is the generalized second price auction part. How much you're actually going to pay is not what you bid, but it's the minimum you could have bid to maintain your ranking. So if I equate these two numbers, I can solve that for the minimum bid that makes this bidder ranked above that bidder. And that's just the total revenue bid by the guy below divided by my clickability score. That's your price per click. How does it know? Now, how much revenue do I expect to get? Well, this is the price per click, but S1 was the amount of clicks I expected to get. So if I multiply the price per click times the expected clicks, this is the revenue the search engine expects. And that's the revenue bid by the bottom position. So this whole pay per click and click scoring essentially has the effect of just having bid for spots on the screen to start with, but it does it in a way that creates more competition. Okay, so this is how it works. Now, something to start to notice this is that your prices depend on these quality scores. So if I think about now this is all efficient, this is all what's efficient, if I'm a revenue maximizing search engine, I might realize that if I reduce the quality score for the guy in the top position, I can actually extract more revenue from him. And if I do that just a little bit, I may not change the rankings very much, but I'm going to charge a higher price to the guy in the first position. And since he gets the most clicks, even though I might charge a lower price to the guy in the second position, it matters most what happens in the top position. So there's a lot of incentives to price discriminate and reduce the quality scores for guys that end up in the top position. So this is something that is the trade-off that the search engines face, and it's something that in particular Google has come under some heat for doing price discrimination against the bidders. So here's a very interesting fact that you might not have appreciated. The prices in these auctions are set incredibly granularly. So every advertiser on every query has their own score. So I'm going to, you all of are bidding to sell your econometrics textbook on the query econometrics textbook, have your own score. So it's basically personalized pricing on a massive scale. Okay, incredibly interesting economic problem and algorithmic problem as well. So here's my example I gave earlier about another kind of trade-off you can have when you're designing a click prediction algorithm. So you might send out your engineers and your statisticians and say, okay, I'm a market maker, I want to get better matches, I want to do a better job ranking, more efficiency, please make a better statistical algorithm. And then the engineers go off and they work hard and they put more variables in the algorithm and they test it out, they go through the experimentation process, and they're so excited because look, I've got a much better predictive power, I'm doing a great job, much better job predicting clicks. But then somebody says, wait a second, over here on the revenue part of the scorecard, we're doing badly. Why? Well, more accurate click prediction is going to thin out the markets. And so your engineering team then is very upset because maybe their algorithm doesn't get released because it hurts revenue too much, even though it had more accuracy. So these are the kinds of things that these platforms have to kind of struggle with, and that's where they really need to understand the economics. So let me just give you an example here. So here's a coarse click predictor. Imagine we have shoes, and there's a men's shoe store and a women's shoe store, and they both get similar profits per click. Okay, so my click predictor can't tell the difference between men and women, and so it gives the same score for each ad for each user when they come in. It's a very competitive market at that point because they're each sort of bidding similarly, and so we can end up sort of extracting a lot of the surplus from the bidders. Now let's suppose we introduce this great new predictor. I'm going to have my statisticians come back and tell me that they've now figured out how to probabilistically identify men and women, and they figured out that men like the men's shoe store and women like the women's shoe store. So now, when a woman comes in, I give a higher quality score, a clickability score for the women's shoe store, and a lower clickability score for the men's shoe store, and vice versa for the men. Now what happens in this auction is that I increase the quality score for the first position, and I decrease the quality score for the men's shoe store for the women, which is going to lead to a lower price per click, because the minimum price the women's shoe store has to pay to be in the top position is now much lower, because we realize that the men's shoe store doesn't generate any revenue. So it's not a very effective competitor, and as a result, the revenue goes down, even though the expected clicks go up. So there's an efficiency revenue trade-off. And again, it's sort of, these are these things that the kind of the, machine learning kind of, engineering folks, if you don't start with a theoretical model that helps you understand this is going to happen, you just get surprised by the results that come off the experimentation platform and have a heart attack about what's going on. Whereas if you come with a theoretical model and a conceptual framework, then you can say, well, this is probably what's going on, and now we can evaluate exactly what the trade-offs were, and maybe there's some ways to modify the algorithm or change reserve prices or other things that can help alleviate that problem, and actually there's nothing wrong with the click predictor at all. Okay? So what I do in my paper with Denis Nekopolov is that we estimate a structural model of advertiser valuations using online data from Microsoft's search engine, and then we take data from a case where we have a click predictor, and then we basically add noise to that click predictor to imagine what would have happened, if you were starting with the bad click predictor and got a better one. Okay, so we call it coarsening because we have data about a good click predictor and we're imagining making it worse. So we can look at the trade-offs between welfare, revenue, and advertiser profit. What you see is that if you hold the bids fixed, and this is what you would see in a short-run experiment when the advertisers don't adjust, the coarsening looks bad for revenue. And that's because we're doing a bad job ranking the ads, and so we're not going to get as many clicks, and so that turns out that reduces revenue with these particular competition. But in the long run, if I made my click prediction algorithm worse, I'm making the advertisers sort of compete more closely with one another. And so when my structural model recomputes a new equilibrium, taking into account that the bidders understand that they're now closer competitors to another, they bid more aggressively and revenue goes up. So this is the kind of conundrum you have when you're mostly doing short-term experiments. The short-term experiment can lead you in one direction, which says that your revenue is going to go down if you have a bad click predictor, whereas in the long run, if you really understood the market, you would realize that revenue might go up when you coarsen the click predictor. And therefore, the models complement the experiments in sort of a deep way. Now, I'm not recommending that actually the search engines go out and hurt efficiency necessarily, but these are the trade-offs, and they have to kind of understand what's happening when they make the trade-offs. Okay. So let me then kind of wrap up some of these kind of, again, summarizing sort of the meta themes that I've kind of discovered in doing theory, experiments, and structural modeling online and offline. First of all, in terms of doing market design, again, participation and welfare trade-offs are really important. And when you design a market, you really have to think about how, say, changing the click prediction algorithm, which is, clearly good for consumers, might have trade-offs between, say, revenue and welfare and advertiser profits. I showed you how I brought together all of these different techniques, and they're complements, not substitutes. And in the online world, which is where a lot of new data for research is going to be coming from, and a lot of new jobs and so on, these models and experiments are both ubiquitous, integral, and essential. Some of the things I learned from going back and forth between academic research and practice, and again, just to sort of explain a little bit what I do with Microsoft is that they've allowed me to use their data for research, and I publish research papers, and then when I discover interesting things, they also just incorporate that into how they run the marketplace. So there's really a very kind of tight integration between the research and what's done in practice, and in particular in the advertiser side where they really need a lot of help learning how to model. There's a very short time span between new modeling that I do and sort of how it gets used in practice. So, in kind of doing this back and forth between actually designing an online market and doing academic research, in some ways the issues, methods, and debates are surprisingly similar in the two arenas. So, the debates about the validity of structural models for long-term predictions, in some sense, what I see that it's an incredibly healthy debate. We should be trying to validate our models. We should be doing experiments that allow us to validate our models. And one of the things I've learned is that I'm going to publish the paper with profit maximizing advertisers, but a lot of the advertisers are not actually profit maximizing. They're doing other stuff. They're trying to be in the first position. A bunch of them are not optimizing very often at all. And so, that feedback from the real world and the fact that my models don't fully pass the validation test tells me to change my models, to develop a Bayesian model where I'm going to allow the data to tell me what the objectives of the advertisers are, to improve the model fit and allow me to do better in validation. And so the real world is pushing me really hard to do that. I had already been believing in it in my timber work, but it's a really healthy debate. And the experiments are actually a great way to complement the structural models to allow you to do that. Some differences, again, in the practical, there's no debate that experiments and models are both crucial. The behavioral assumptions are more controversial in practice for good reason, because the guys aren't profit maximizing, so they should be controversial. Some of them are. The finance guys on the top keywords bidding on auto insurance are hyper rational, but the guys that are doing $100 a month of business, it's just not worth their time to get in there and really profit maximize in sort of the standard way. They're profit maximizing in a bigger sense, which is that they're not wasting their time on this, so they're not responding to changes in the system. The experimental methods are actually much better developed in practice. So, there's a lot of R&D going on inside firms about how to do large-scale online experimentation, how to use the same users to do multiple experiments in the same time so that you as a user are in 6 different experiments, and how do you do it without them interfering with one another, and so on. So it's not, I don't know if it's the most interesting research in the world, but it's interesting. I find it interesting when I get asked the questions, and I certainly see that, they're kind of inside the firms are actually racing ahead of outside the firms just because they're dealing with these practical problems on a regular basis. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the econometric insights about causality and the best ways to use observational data are not fully appreciated in practice and by other disciplines other than economics. And so I've been kind of out there trying to recruit people to do research in this area, and maybe I'll do some myself as well, but I think it's sort of an open area for interdisciplinary collaboration that I think will have a lot of promise over the next few years. Okay, so thanks.
Great, thanks very much.
Thanks very much for a great talk. So Richard asked me to start off with a few questions. I of course don't want to monopolise the discussion in any way. So in light of that, actually my first question. So what is sort of, in your view, the proper role of sort of antitrust in these sorts of online markets in particular? I mean, it's known that sort of search and so on are rather concentrated markets, and you sort of discussed things from a market design perspective. But it seems clear that potentially there might be competition policy issues also. If I could just add a second question, I'm curious to know how sort of companies like Microsoft and Google also think about the rationality of consumers and users online, and how that sort of factors into model design.
Great. Okay. Well, so in some sense, my disclaimer at the beginning of the talk about conflicts and so on really wasn't necessary for anything I've said so far. But I think when you start talking about antitrust policy, you should take I have a particular point of view that's very much influenced by my own experience. In some sense, at the beginning of all this, I sort of pick the horse of which firm I wanted to work with, and part of the reason I chose working for Microsoft, even though they're sort of, at that time nobody even heard of their search engine, was that I felt that I would much rather work for the firm who's kind of where the innovation and so on is in these kind of social interests, and when you're sort of the second place competitor in a market that might become a monopoly, you're very much working in favor of competition and sort of generally thinking more about, social welfare. So, I certainly have seen a number of things that I said today kind of bear on the antitrust controversies. First of all, experimentally, you can see very clearly that how you rank things really affects clicks. So you're kind of, when you're designing a web page, you're kind of a puppeteer. And you can really move clicks around. So just kind of going back to this particular thing on the ads, kind of the causal effect, for this case of the ads, of kind of moving things down the page is that you're losing a fair number of your clicks. If you do this for algo links, and actually I've done this for real experiments, you can really see the causal effect of, say, taking a Google link and putting it on the top, say putting Google Finance on top if you do a search for finance instead of Yahoo, which is the most popular link, is going to take a bunch of clicks away from Yahoo Finance and give them to Google Finance. So, we use these experiments and so on, you can learn the causal effect and you realize that yes, you have the ability to drive traffic to your own websites. And it's not the case that users will just ignore it and go to Yahoo anyways, they'll actually click on Google if you move them around. That's less true if you type in Amazon, as your search query, you're going to go to Amazon. Okay, that's a navigational query. But if you type in something generic, then you can move the clicks around. And so just understanding that and having these experimental evidence that proves that definitively and what large magnitudes it has is really important for people to understand when you think about, well, is it a problem to have a monopoly search engine that's vertically integrated into a bunch of downstream businesses? Yes, absolutely. If they want to be the #1 finance site, they can make themselves, maybe not #1, but they can certainly make themselves a much more popular finance site, which then attracts more ad revenue to the site and attracts more other content to the site, which makes it in turn a better site. So they can sort of influence the market in that way. The second thing that comes out of some of this discussion, I think the antitrust regulators, when they first start looking at something like this, have a little bit of trouble thinking about markets for a free good. Everybody loves Google, like you've been here, everybody in Europe basically uses Google. There's a small market share for Bing, but that's, very small. So, you all love Google, it helps you find stuff. Well, it turns out that your experience actually isn't as good as it could be. There's much less innovation in Europe than there would be if there were 50-50 market shares here, and innovations get rolled out here more slowly and so on. And there's less sort of country-specific innovation, but you're actually kind of free riding on the US. So part of the reason that Google is as good as it is in Europe is actually when they do all the R&D to help keep themselves dominant in the US where there is competition, that R&D spills over to Europe, and so you still get good search results. So you kind of just take for granted that you wake up in the morning and you have good search results, but in fact you shouldn't take that for granted. If Bing exited in the US, you would have much worse search results. Another thing is just trying to understand, well, if they give it away for free, how can consumers be harmed? Is that, they're somewhat harmed by putting Google Finance on top. And one of the things that you see when you actually do this market design from the inside is how you're constantly making trade-offs between the different constituents. And so competition is really going to force you to keep prices low for advertisers, to keep the experience good for users, and that competition can really impact, how good an experience, how much you put weight on revenue versus the other constituents. Just as an example, I can get more, anything I put that's flashy on the screen is going to take clicks away from the rest of the screen. So I come up with some great new algorithmic content that doesn't generate any revenue. And I put that like some, suggested search box, I make it really big, or some like definitions or answers that come in and take up a lot of space on the screen. If I put that up there, that's taking money right out of the ads. Okay, right out of the ads. The better is your algorithmic page, the less ad revenue you get. So you got a $30 billion business, and you're thinking about, okay, this is gonna, divert 0.5% of clicks or 1% of clicks from ads to algo. Sounds small, that's like, oh, that's too tiny to even measure. Well, no, I measure it pretty damn precisely, because I've got, billions of queries, so I know what that's gonna do. Why would I give up, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue just to make users happy if I have all my users already? That would be violating my fiduciary duty to my shareholders, So if you have no competition, you're gonna not roll out some of these flashy user innovations that hurt you in terms of ad revenue. So the competition comes in very different ways. It's not just a price that's charged to consumers, but it's quite present in the long run. These industries, by the way, it costs well over $1 billion a year to run one of these search engines. The R&D organizations have hundreds and hundreds of PhDs and hundreds of millions of dollars going into R&D. And you sure as heck aren't just throwing that money away for nothing. The R&D is really responding to competition.
So
in the framework you talked about, there are two platforms, and there's endogenous entry of the producers. Now you start thinking of, 10 years from now, endogenous entry of the consumers, which leads to emergence of various platforms. Would market design still be as important? I mean, if you have lots and lots of small apps which build social networks, and there's endogenous entry of consumers into various platforms.
Well, so I think that, like, if you think about the apps world, the market design questions are different, but in some ways similar. So first of all, if you define an app store, all the stuff I talked about with eBay also matters. So how you help people search for apps is going to affect the incentives to create apps and what kind of apps get produced. Then how do the apps get monetized? Well, if some of them are using in-app advertising, then the advertising platform is going to be really important, as is the design of that platform. And how am I going to make money on your little mobile devices? Well, I'm going to do that because I have all this information about the consumers that's going to help me target the ad. So I'm going to have one little tiny spot for an ad, so it better be the right ad, and maybe an Angry Birds, I don't really know what ad is good. But if I've got really good information, I can put a tiny little ad that's exactly the right ad for you standing right here today at this moment in time, because I realize that probably you're just looking for a beer after school, after work. Okay. So that's going to lead to a lot of economies of scale and concentration, because the ad platform that does the best job understanding using machine learning exactly what you want right now in this place, drawing inferences from both what other people like you have wanted standing here, as well as what you usually do at this time of day, those machine learning algorithms will give the right ad to you. And so we expect the market design for those platforms and stuff is going to be really important. And we should be very worried about monopoly in those platforms as well, because there's huge economies of scale in the data, the information, and the ad platform, just like there is in search.